Anybody have questions for Stephen or for Mr. Hassett? Nobody wants to talk about the economy? Sure. IRS? Okay, go ahead.
This would be for either one of you. So we reported, several other outlets have reported that about 3,500 people are due to be lose their jobs at the IRS by the end of the week. Mm-hmm. If the goal of these spending cuts across the federal government has been to reduce the debt, why impose some of the deepest cuts we've seen so far at the agency responsible for raising revenue for the federal government?
Well, I think our objective is to make sure that the employees that we pay are being productive and effective. And there are many, more than 100,000 people working to collect taxes, and not all of them are fully occupied. And the Treasury Secretary is studying the matter and feels like 3,500 is a small number, and probably can get bigger, especially as we improve the IT at the IRS. And so I think that it's absolutely something that is on the table for good reasons. And the point is that don't just talk about the IRS, talk about all of government. That there are so many places. I live in D.C. You maybe live in D.C. where nobody's going to the buildings. People aren't commuting because nobody's doing their job. We look back and we see that there are all these people doing two jobs while they're getting a government payroll on the payroll. So the point is we're fixing that, and the IRS is a small part of that picture.
So you're saying that everybody who's being let go was doing a bad job?
I'm saying that we're studying every agency and deciding who to let go and why. And we're doing so very rationally with a lot of support from analysis.
Because we're being told by a lot of people who have been let go at other agencies that they were told they were being dismissed because of poor performance, when in some cases they haven't even had a performance review yet because they've only been on the job a couple of months.
Yeah, I've never seen a person who was laid off for poor performance say that they were performing poorly. Okay.
Carolyn?
Good point. Sure, Caitlin.
I have a question. I'll start with you, Kevin Hassett. Thank you for being here. And then I've got a question for Mr. Waltz. On these potential checks that you might send out from DOGE, is there a concern as you're thinking through this that they could be inflationary?
Oh, absolutely not, because imagine if we don't spend government money and we give it back to people, then if they spend it all, then you're even. But they're probably going to save a lot of it, in which case you're reducing inflation. Okay, so and also, when the government spends a lot, that's what creates inflation. We learned that from Joe Biden. And so if we reduce government spending, then that's, reduces inflation. And if you give people money, then they're going to save a bunch of it. And when they save it, then that also reduces demand and reduces inflation.
Okay, so you're not worried about it. And
no,
Mr. Waltz, to follow up on Peter's question, you wrote in an op-ed in the fall of 2023 that, quote, Putin is to blame, certainly like Al-Qaeda was to blame for 9/11. Mm-hmm. Do you still feel that way now, or do you share the president's assessment as he says Ukraine is to blame for the start of this war?
Well, it shouldn't surprise you that I share the president's assessment on all kinds of issues. What I wrote as a member of Congress was as a former member of Congress. Look, what I share the president's assessment on is that the war has to end. And what comes with that? What comes with that should be, at some point, elections. What comes with that should be peace. What comes with that is prosperity that we've just offered in this natural resources and economic partnership arrangement, an end to the killing, and European security and security for the world. The president's not only determined to do that in Europe, he's determined to do it in the Middle East. And just a few months ago, we had an administration that had tried for 15 months. Week after week, sitting with you here and couldn't get us to a ceasefire, couldn't get our hostages out. Now we're at that point. We're back to the maximum pressure on Iran, and we have just begun, and we will drive towards a ceasefire and all of those other steps. I'm not going to pre-negotiate or get ahead of the sequencing of all of that. It's a very delicate situation, but this is a president of peace, and who here would argue against peace?
Okay, so you do share that assessment. And can I follow up? In 2017,
go ahead,
then
Jordan.
President Trump.
Go ahead,
Can I just
Jordan.
follow up
You
really
just
quick?
had two questions, Caitlin. Jordan, go ahead.
Mr.
I have an important
Hassett.
follow-up.
Jordan, go ahead.
So,
Go ahead.
Mr. Hassett, you were speaking about tariff revenue, and you also addressed a question about the IRS. President Trump has spoken about replacing income tax with tariff revenue, especially with all this waste, fraud, and abuse that we're seeing cut. Is that a possibility?
Absolutely. And in fact, if you think about the China tariff revenue that we're estimating is coming in from the 10% that we just added, plus the de minimis thing, that it's between $500 billion and $1 trillion over 10 years is our estimate. And that's something that is outside of the reductions that markets are seeing through the negotiations up on the Hill. And so we expect that the tariff revenue is actually going to make it much easier for Republicans to pass a bill, and that was the president's plan all along.
And then I have a question for Stephen Miller about DOGE. So you spoke about DOGE. You said roughly $50 billion is set to be cut in a year of waste, fraud, and abuse by unelected bureaucrats. we're hearing this ironic narrative from the president's critics and the left-wing media that Elon Musk is an unelected bureaucrat and he's doing all this terrible stuff. Isn't one of Doge's objectives to get rid of the federal bureaucracy, the deep state? And also, who was running the White House when Joe Biden was in office? Because I don't know a single person who believes it was Joe Biden.
Yes, you're tempting me to say some very harsh things about some of our media friends. Yes, it is true that many of the people in this room for 4 years failed to cover the fact that Joe Biden was mentally incompetent and was not running the country. It is also true that many people in this room who have used this talking point that Elon is not elected fail to understand how government works. So I'm glad for the opportunity for a brief civics lesson. A president is elected by the whole American people. He's the only official in the entire government that is elected by the entire nation, right? Judges are appointed, members of Congress are elected at the district or state level, which is one man. And the Constitution, Article 2, has a clause known as the vesting clause, and it says the executive power shall be vested in a president, singular. The whole will of democracy is imbued into the elected president. That president then appoints staff to then impose that democratic will onto the government. The threat to democracy, indeed the existential threat to democracy, is the unelected bureaucracy of lifetime tenured civil servants who believe they answer to no one, who believe they can do whatever they want without consequence, who believe they can set their own agenda no matter what Americans vote for. So Americans vote for radical FBI reform, and FBI agents say they don't want to change. Or Americans vote for radical reform on our energy policies, but EPA bureaucrats say they don't want to change. Or Americans vote to end DEI, racist DEI policies, and lawyers at the Department of Justice say they don't want to change. What President Trump is doing is he is removing federal bureaucrats who are defying democracy by failing to implement his lawful orders, which are the will of the whole American people. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Stephen. One of the things that President Trump cares most about is job creation, and it was about 7 years ago I had the honor of joining you in this room for the first time, and it looks like we've created a lot more jobs in the last month. Look at how many people are here. My estimate is about 180, but I didn't count. So thank you. It's really an honor to be back here. I think that I just want to go over a few things and then hand it off to Mike. The first thing is that the president has told us to prioritize fighting inflation. And he had to do that because, as you know, President Biden let inflation get completely out of control. And he did it with policies that made no sense. They made no sense. A lot of times people say to us, our friends the journalists, why are you doing that? But I like to think, why did they do that? Why did they spend so much money? And then why did the Fed print so much money so that we had inflation as high as we've ever seen since Jimmy Carter? So why did they do that? So we're addressing inflation. We didn't have to address it in the first term because it was always in the ones, almost always. But we're going to get it back there. And how are we doing it? Well, we're doing it with a plan that President Trump and I and others have talked about in the Oval that involves like every level of fighting inflation. First, the macroeconomic level. We're cutting spending. We're cutting spending in negotiations with people on the Hill. We're cutting spending with the advice of our IT consultant, Elon Musk. And then we're also looking into supply side things, like restoring Trump's tax cuts, maybe even expensing new factories so that there's an explosion of supply. If you have an explosion of supply and a reduction in government demand, then inflation goes way down. And then one of the things that you want to say is, well, when are you going to see it? Well, the first thing that you'll see when the markets believe that we're going to get inflation under control is that the 10-year Treasury rate goes down, because that's how they think about future expected inflation. And so we're still going to see some memory of Biden's inflation. It's not going to go away in a month. But the 10-year Treasury before the last consumer price index had dropped about 40 basis points. 40 basis points because markets were optimistic about our ability to fight inflation. 40 basis points is kind of not a fun thing to say. Economists talk that way. I apologize. But the way to think about it is, for a typical mortgage, if that affects the mortgage rate, then it's going to save a typical family buying a house about $1,000 a year. And that's just in our first month. Okay. The second thing we've done is we've had a lot of trade talks. In fact, I was just meeting a minister from Mexico with Howard Lutnick just a couple of hours ago. And we're talking about reciprocal trade, and we're also talking about the fentanyl crisis. And so reciprocal trade is about our government treating other governments the way they treat us. We want trade to be fair. It turns out that Americans have been disadvantaged by foreign governments over and over, and President Trump wants it to stop. And the fact that struck me as most noticeable when I started to look at what President Trump was asking us to do is that last year we have data, U.S. companies paid $370 billion in taxes to foreign governments. $370 billion. Last year, foreign multinationals paid us $57 billion in taxes. We have 1/4 of world GDP. They have 3/4 of world GDP, and we're paying 370, they're paying 57. This is not reciprocal. We're going to try, or we're going to, fix it. The other thing that we've done is we've had an all-of-the-above energy approach that's led by Doug Burgum and Chris and a really large team, EPA. And we've already made so many actions that are going to affect the price of energy and lower inflation. We've opened up 625 million acres to energy exploration. We've cut 50 years of red tape that makes it so you can't have permits. And we've even made it so that when you go home, if you get a new one, then you can take a shower or flush a toilet or read under a light bulb. We're doing that too. So finally, let's just think about like the facts that we can see right now that we think are awesome. So guess what? Small business optimism has gone up by the most ever since President Trump came in. ISM, which is the measure of what's going on in manufacturing, it's expanding again for the first time in years. CEO confidence is the highest it's been in years. And the reason people are thinking this is that our policies give people cause for optimism. And then I want to reiterate what Stephen Miller said, because it's so important, and it's so important for financial markets to start to digest this, that if, say, the Treasury Secretary or any cabinet secretary with Elon Musk is able to find some savings, say $100 billion, well, in CBO land, that's actually like about 10 times that, or maybe 12 times that, over a 10-year window. And so when you're thinking about the negotiations right now over reconciliation and thinking about, well, 4 trillion, 5 trillion, well, those numbers in terms of the savings are going to end up being small because of all the waste that we're finding. And so we're incredibly optimistic about the future of inflation and the future of our economy. And we're optimistic because we're making so much progress so far, and we already see it in market prices.